The sky darkened slowly, and with it, the city began to shift. The park filled with shadows, but Elizabeth, sitting with a single rose pressed to her chest, looked like something out of another time. A woman who had lost everything because of one act of compassion, now being silently watched by someone who knew exactly how that felt. Night swallowed the bench, yet that moment hung in the air, suspended like fate had just turned a life-changing page. Have you ever felt like a complete stranger somehow knew exactly what you needed, without saying a single word? If this story has touched your heart so far, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. There's still so much more to come. The real reason Elizabeth was fired goes way beyond what anyone could have imagined. When protecting someone turns into a mistake, all that's left is the courage to face the fallout. The front of Wellington Academy gleamed like polished gold under the midday sun. From the outside, it was picture-perfect. Marble columns, wide windows, and grass trimmed with mathematical precision. But inside, the rules were ironclad, and the dress code weighed heavier than any book in the library. Elizabeth Harper, in her simple dress and worn-out shoes, didn't quite fit that polished world. Yet there, between poems and metaphors, she taught her students to think with their hearts. Daniel had stood out since day one, quiet, alert, notebooks always spotless. He had this hunger for learning that jumped right off the page. Elizabeth saw something in him, something beyond grades. It was the same hunger she'd felt as a little girl growing up in foster care, searching for safety in books and teachers who only saw her as a number. But Daniel, he had the soul of a writer, even if he didn't have a place to sleep. It was a quiet Friday afternoon when Elizabeth found him curled up in the back of the library, hiding behind a stack of encyclopedias. "Daniel," she called gently. He looked up, startled, like he'd just been caught committing a crime. I was just resting for a bit." She noticed the deep circles under his eyes, his torn sneakers, the smell of stale rain. This wasn't study fatigue, it was the exhaustion of someone without a home. That night, Elizabeth brought 2 extra sandwiches. She left a folded blanket on one of the armchairs, pretending it was all a coincidence. But Daniel got the message. "Thank you, miss," he whispered, eyes glistening. She simply nodded, like someone who knows kindness doesn't need a spotlight. And so it continued, a quiet understanding night after night among pages of Shakespeare and hot chocolate hidden in the bottom of her bag. The problem started when someone saw. A janitor, noticing the blanket and food wrappers the next morning, quietly reported it to the coordinator. Within days, the school board was involved. Elizabeth was summoned to the IC office, where 6 expressionless faces awaited her. "You acted in a way that is completely incompatible with the values of this institution," the principal said, voice like ice. "Wellington Academy values order, image, and security." "Security for who?" she asked, voice cracked with wounded pride. "For those who have a bed to sleep in," but her words found no echo. All she heard was, "Your behavior has compromised the school's reputation." And just like that, the decision was final. Immediate termination. No contact with students, no explanation allowed, no goodbyes, nothing. Just a brutal silence, as if she'd committed the worst crime of all, feeling compassion. But the worst part wasn't the humiliation. It was seeing Daniel's eyes when he found out. He tried to run to her but was held back. "It was because of me, wasn't it?" he yelled, shoving his skinny shoulders against the guards. Elizabeth shook her head forcefully, swallowing her tears. She couldn't let him carry that weight. But he knew, and so did she. In that moment, they both understood the cost of a kindness that didn't fit the rules. She walked out of that school carrying a box and a broken heart. No one walked with her. Not a single colleague spoke up. The halls that once echoed with poetry now felt like a courtroom. All that remained were Daniel's eyes in her memory, and the quiet certainty that, even if she was thrown out, she had done the right thing. But one question kept pounding in her head. Why does doing the right thing hurt so much? Sometimes, when you refuse to look away, the whole world turns its back on you. But what Elizabeth didn't know was that even outside those school walls, someone else had been watching her all along, and it wasn't Daniel. The apartment Elizabeth now lived in was small, stuffy, and loud. Every step on the warped floorboards let out a groan, as if protesting another burden on its tired frame. The peeling walls reeked of old mildew, and the only luxury was the stack of books she insisted on keeping by her mattress. Nights came quietly, but sleep rarely showed up. She'd toss and turn, tangled in memories and doubts. Was I just too naive, she wondered, staring up at the ceiling as if the cracks might hold the answers. By day, she reinvented herself however she could. She started tutoring students in cafes, public libraries, and in homes of families who either didn't know or didn't care about her sudden firing. Parents called her dedicated, insightful, brilliant, but none of them knew what she had lost. Elizabeth smiled politely, but each compliment twisted like a knife, reminding her of everything she couldn't hold on to. Daniel, on the other hand, had become a ghost. No contact, no messages. All she knew came from whispers of former students. He's different now. Doesn't talk to anyone. He almost got expelled. His absence hurt more than losing her job. It was like someone had torn out a part of her she didn't know existed. And still, she couldn't do anything but wait and hope. Then something strange happened on a trip to the market. Elizabeth was in line, digging through her bag for coins to cover the bill, when the cashier said, "It's already been paid." She turned, confused, but saw no one she recognized. Just a man standing at a distance, wearing a cap and gardening gloves, watching her with that same calm, steady gaze. Before she could thank him, he slipped out through the side door. The next day, a vase of fresh flowers sat outside her door. No note, just that same red rose, this time joined by lavender and soft peach dahlias. It confused her more than words ever could. Who was he, and why did he always seem to be around? She started noticing things. Light footsteps on the stairs when she got home late. Faint shadows crossing the street, the quiet presence of someone who didn't want to be seen, but who was always there. One night, while walking home, a group of teenagers surrounded her on the sidewalk. One of them reached out, smirking, "Hey, teacher with no school, want to give us a lesson?" She froze, unsure whether to run or scream, but then, out of the darkness, the gardener appeared, tall, silent, eyes blazing blue. "Leave, now!" His voice was low, firm, unshakable. The boys backed off, muttering curses, and vanished down the alley. Elizabeth stood there, frozen. The man turned toward her, as if he were about to speak, but said nothing. He simply took off his cap, gave a small nod, and disappeared once again into the shadows. That night she didn't sleep. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper. Recognition. Like fate was nudging her toward something new, and she wasn't sure whether to run from it or toward it. Deep down, she knew. People don't show up that often by accident. No one protects like that without a reason. And no one looks at you like that without carrying a story of their own. What did he see in her? What was he hiding behind those rough hands and his constant silence? Elizabeth began watching too. Her eyes searched for him in the park, at the store, even in the rain, and every time she felt lost, he was there. Like time itself had made room for him to protect her. Some people enter our lives like whispers, and without saying a word, they make noise inside us. But as much as she longed for answers, the mystery of William still felt locked away, tangled in secrets he wasn't ready to share. The hours crawled by on that rainy Wednesday. Elizabeth had no students booked, no errands to fake a routine. The sound of water dripping down the gutter echoed through the apartment, and the scent of wet paper mixed with the cooling coffee in her cup. She paced back and forth, staring at the dried bouquet in the vase, the wilted rose, still a reminder of the moment when everything had started to change. The longing she felt for William was far too big for the short time they'd actually spent together. But how do you measure a presence that feels like it lives inside you? By late afternoon, for no logical reason, she grabbed her coat and walked out. The park was soaked, the benches dripping, the trees looked like they were crying too. And there he was, as if he'd known she would come. William stood beside a blooming bush, his shirt clinging to his chest, his face as calm as always. When he saw her, he didn't smile, but his eyes said everything. Elizabeth walked toward him without hesitation, like the cold and rain didn't exist. "You always find me before I even start looking," she said with a tired smile. "Maybe it's because you've never stopped looking," he answered softly. She shifted her weight, trying to understand the invisible dance between them. "I don't know what this is, William, but I know you make the world feel a little less cruel." He took a deep breath and pulled an envelope from his pocket. "I want to show you something, but not today. Just trust me." She took the envelope but didn't open it. Something told her the time wasn't right yet, so she kept it close, like a promise made of paper. Then William reached out his hand, and for the first time she held it. His cold fingers laced through hers, and a strange warmth bloomed, like his touch had found a part of her no one else had ever reached. And there they stayed, in silence, rain falling like a quiet blessing. In the days that followed, Elizabeth began to seek him out, not out of need, but out of choice. They started walking the park trails together, sharing quiet moments and broken pieces of their pasts. William never spoke of where he came from, but he left traces in scattered phrases. "I didn't always live here. I used to be someone else." When she pushed further, he gently pulled away. But the pain in his voice when he spoke of absence, it mirrored hers. Meanwhile, Daniel kept fighting. Even suspended, he studied on his own. Elizabeth left notes hidden in public library books she knew he'd find. Poems, writing exercises, little messages like, "You're not alone. Write. Keep going." It was what she herself needed to hear too. One evening, William showed up at her building, something he'd never done before. His eyes were red, his beard unshaved. "Can you just listen tonight?" Elizabeth nodded, stepping aside. He sat on the floor, beside her piles of books, and for a long time said nothing. Then he whispered, "Sometimes the past comes back in dreams, but what hurts most is waking up." She reached for his hand, and in that touch, he finally seemed to breathe again. In the days that followed, William started leaving notes on her door. Poems, lines from Emily Dickinson, Pablo Neruda, Fernando Pessoa. Each phrase felt hand-picked for her exact wounds. Elizabeth taped them to her wall like she was building a quilt of meaning, and every line became a cure for the hopelessness. It was as if he saw inside her, knew the pieces she hadn't even named. Some connections are born long before a kiss or a confession. And sometimes real love begins when we stop running from our pain and choose to walk beside someone who already recognizes our broken pieces. A light rain fell steadily, painting the city in shades of gray and silence. Elizabeth walked through the park like someone searching for something they couldn't quite name. Her thin coat did nothing to block the chill that came from within. She carried a bag with bread and worn-out books, just back from another tutoring session that barely covered rent. Her steps were slow, almost resigned, and then she saw him. Standing beneath the soaked branches of a tree, William, or the man she only knew by that name, gazed into the distance, his shoulders wet, hands tucked into his pockets. She stopped. Her heart pounded like she was about to make a mistake. Something inside told her she couldn't keep walking without speaking to him. She made her way toward him, taking a deep breath, and for the first time, didn't look away. You always show up when I need you most. Who are you, really?" Her voice trembled, but not from fear, from truth. He turned slowly. Rain streaked his face. His eyes were clear. "I'm just someone who admires you. From afar." The simplicity of his answer disarmed her. "That's not really an answer," she said with a bittersweet smile. "I have nothing, William. No school, no future. Why would someone like you waste your time on someone like me?" He dropped his gaze, like her question hurt. "Because flowers still bloom even in the most broken soil, and you have flowers in your soul." Elizabeth bit her lip, holding back tears. No student, no principal, no colleague had ever said anything like that to her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled bouquet of wildflowers. Violets, daisies, basil. "It's not much, but I thought of you." Elizabeth took it with both hands, as if holding a promise. "You brighten this place more than they ever could," he whispered. For a moment, time froze. No sound of cars, no barking dogs, just the two of them, and a longing that felt ancient, despite not having a past. She wanted to ask more, push through, break the armor. But he stepped back. "I can't stay. Not yet." And just like that, with the same gentleness he always carried, he turned and disappeared down the trail. Elizabeth stood there holding the wet bouquet with a strange ache in her chest, something between loss and hope. It was like loving the wind, knowing it's there, but never being able to hold it. That night, she placed the flowers in a makeshift vase, a glass bottle. She lit a candle, made tea, and sat on the floor surrounded by open books. She tried to write, like she used to in better times, but only one sentence came out. "Some silences are louder than any scream." She thought of Daniel, of the students she never got to say goodbye to, of the poems no one wanted to hear anymore. And somewhere in the middle of all that, she thought of him. The next nights were different. She began to look for him, not out of desperation, but with the quiet curiosity of someone who knows something important still hasn't been said. She started noticing the small things, a bench with scattered petals, a freshly swept trail in the park, birds that always seemed to land near where he used to be. It felt like the world itself was conspiring to keep her alert and alive. Meanwhile, Daniel stayed silent. A former student confided that he'd read a poem aloud about grief and cried during the reading. Elizabeth knew, deep down, there was still a bridge between them. She sent books anonymously to the house she thought he was staying in. Tucked inside were notes between the pages. "You are not alone. Keep writing. Hold on." It was exactly what she needed to hear herself. When love begins to bloom without a name, without an explanation, and without permission, something inside us changes. But sometimes, the ones we want closest are the very ones who won't let us reach them. The hours dragged on through that rainy Wednesday. Elizabeth had no student scheduled, no plans to fake a routine. The sound of rain trickling down the gutters echoed through the tiny apartment, and the smell of damp paper mixed with the cold coffee in her cup. She paced back and forth, gazing at the dried bouquet in the vase, the wilted rose still reminding her of the moment everything began to shift. The ache she felt for William was far too big for the time they'd actually spent together. But how do you measure a presence that feels like it lives inside you? By late afternoon, for no logical reason, she threw on her coat and went for a walk. The park was soaked, benches wet, trees dripping like they were mourning too. And there he was, as if he'd known she was coming. William stood beside a flowering bush, his shirt clinging to his chest, his face calm as always. When he saw her, he didn't smile, but his eyes said everything. Elizabeth walked toward him, as if the cold and rain didn't exist. "You always find me before I even start looking," she said with a tired smile. "Maybe because you never stopped looking," he replied quietly. She shrank a little, trying to make sense of this invisible dance between them. "I don't know what this is, William, But I know you make the world feel a little less cruel." He took a deep breath and pulled an envelope from his pocket. "I want to show you something, but not today. Just trust me." She took it, but didn't open it. The timing didn't feel right. Instead, she held onto the gesture like a paper promise pressed to her chest. Then William reached out, and for the first time she took his hand, his cold fingers laced into hers, and somehow that simple touch ignited something warm, as if it reached a part of her no one else had ever touched. They stood there, in silence, with the rain falling over them like a quiet blessing. In the days that followed, Elizabeth started seeking him out. Not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. They began walking the park trails together, sharing silence and fragmented stories. William never said where he came from, but he left breadcrumbs in scattered phrases. "I didn't always live here. I used to be someone else." Whenever she tried to ask more, he would gently steer the conversation away. But the pain in his voice when he spoke of loss mirrored her own. Meanwhile, Daniel kept fighting. Even suspended, he studied on his own. Elizabeth hid notes in public library books she knew he'd pick up, poems, writing exercises, little slips of encouragement. "You're not alone. Write. Keep going." It was what she needed to hear too. One night, William showed up at her building, something he'd never done before. His eyes were red, his beard unshaved. "Can you just listen tonight?" Elizabeth nodded, letting him in. He sat on the floor, near her towers of books, and for a long time said nothing. Then he whispered, "Sometimes the past comes back in dreams, but what hurts the most is waking up." She reached out and touched his hand, and in that touch, he seemed to breathe again. In the days that followed, William began leaving notes at her door. Poems, lines from Emily Dickinson, Pablo Neruda, Fernando Pessoa. Each line felt chosen just for her exact wounds. Elizabeth taped them to her wall like she was building a quilt of meaning, and each note became a thread pulling her back from despair. It was as if he saw inside her, new parts of her even she hadn't named. Some bonds are born long before the first kiss or confession, and sometimes real love begins when we finally stop running from our pain and choose to walk beside someone who already recognizes our scattered pieces. Elizabeth's situation had become unbearable. Tutoring jobs were drying up, bills stacked like waves crashing against a worn-out stone. And then came the landlord's message, cold and sharp. "You have 3 days to leave." The words echoed through her empty apartment like a sentence. She hung up without the strength to argue. For the first time, she seriously thought about giving up, moving back to the countryside, disappearing, erasing herself from the world. But then Daniel's face hit her like a punch to the chest. If she gave up, what would happen to him? Not long after, a student told her Daniel had been suspended again. He got into a fight with a boy who called him street trash. Elizabeth felt her stomach turn. She wanted to run to him, protect him, scream at the school. But legally, she was banned from getting close. Desperation took over her trembling hands as she shut the kitchen window. "I failed him. I failed again," she whispered, curling up on the floor, her face buried in her knees. With nowhere to go, she headed to the park. The light drizzle had returned. The trees swayed like grieving hands. She sat on the bench where she had so often found William, but this time he didn't come. Hours passed. The sky darkened. The cold grew sharper. Still she stayed. Her face was wet, not just from the rain, but from sorrow, fear, and loneliness. Just as she was about to leave, she heard footsteps on the wet grass. William emerged from the fog, his eyes tight, mouth drawn. "You're shaking," he said, taking off his coat and draping it over her shoulders. Elizabeth didn't resist. "I've lost everything, William. The school, Daniel, my home. Even you disappear when I need you most." He knelt in front of her, gently taking her cold hands. "I never meant to hurt you, but there are things, pieces of me you don't know, and I don't know if I could handle seeing them reflected in your eyes." She looked at him. "Try, because this isn't about me anymore. It's about us." William held her like she was made of glass, and in that embrace was something different, a quiet kind of desperation, as if he knew time was running out. "It's gonna be okay," he whispered. But his voice cracked. Elizabeth wanted to believe him. She just didn't know if she could. "Who are you, really?" she asked, resting her forehead against his chest. William pulled back slowly, his eyes full. "You'll know, but not yet." And then he vanished. In the days that followed, she didn't see him. Not in the park, not in the library, not on the streets. It was like he'd dissolved into thin air. Elizabeth found herself back at square one, alone, exhausted, and haunted by the feeling that maybe it had all been a dream. His absence ached like something ancient, like a void that had existed long before they met. She started doubting herself. What if he was never real? What if I made all of this up, just to survive the pain? She tried to focus on writing, but the words slipped away. Even Daniel had gone silent. No messages, no signs. It felt like everyone had disappeared at once. And then, one sleepless night, Elizabeth felt the urge to give up stronger than ever before. She sat on the floor, surrounded by notebooks and old notes, and cried the way she hadn't since she was a child, softly, alone, with her soul in ruins. But among the scattered pages, an envelope slipped off the shelf and landed on the floor. It was the one William had given her, the one she'd never dared to open. With red eyes and a shattered heart, she finally tore it open. Inside was a single key and an address. She stared at the paper for a long time, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Maybe this was the answer to everything, or maybe it was nothing. Sometimes the bottom isn't dark because there's no light, but because it's the only place where we finally look inward. And Elizabeth was about to find out that even the deepest pit can become a path. She woke to the sound of the envelope sliding off the shelf and hitting the floor, as if it had decided on its own that it was time. She stared at it for several seconds before kneeling down and picking it up. Her hands shook, her heart pounded. Inside, she found a key and a simple note. "You deserve more than what you've lost. Trust." On the back, an address written in the steady, familiar handwriting she knew so well. For the first time, something shifted inside her, movement in the soul. With no idea what to expect, she threw on a coat, tied up her hair, and followed the address. It led her to an old, modest building, its front covered in ivy. A wooden sign read, "Sol Domeo Community Library." She stepped inside, heart racing. The scent of aged paper wrapped around her like a hug. Tall shelves, rare books, rough wooden tables, a magical space, completely empty. On one of the tables sat an open book. Elizabeth approached. It was an old copy of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, its margins filled with handwritten notes, reflections, interpretations, emotional responses to the verses. But these weren't ordinary annotations, they were confessions. "Today, I felt like living again. I saw someone who reminded me who I used to be. She teaches with her soul. I wish I had the courage to say who I really am." Elizabeth touched the page with trembling fingers. It felt like William had left pieces of himself, just waiting for her to find. She spent hours there, reading note after note, tucked into different books. It was like hearing his voice in every line. She learned the library had been recently bought and restored. The cleaning woman confirmed. A quiet man, blue eyes, said he wanted to build a place where tired souls could breathe again. Elizabeth smiled through tears. It was a gift, a silent way of saying, "I believe in you." That night she returned home with new energy. She reorganized her books, swept the floor, lit a candle. She opened a notebook she'd saved for ideas and began to write, not a lesson plan, not a curriculum, but her story, her pain, her falls, the moments she wanted to disappear, and the little miracles that kept her going. The words poured out like a river held back for years. For the first time, writing wasn't about teaching, it was about surviving. In the days that followed, she returned to the library every day. She brought tea in her bag, read out loud, left notes in books filled with verses she loved. It was like building a conversation with someone who wasn't there, an invisible exchange between two broken souls who somehow found wholeness in the margins. Even without seeing him, she felt him, watching, protecting, waiting for the right moment to be known. Daniel, too, reappeared, quietly. A note reached her through an old student. "I got the books. Thank you for not giving up on me." That was all it took for Elizabeth to feel whole again. She wrote back, "Keep going. You've already survived the worst. Now, all that's left is to keep holding on." It felt like their story was still being written, maybe not by their hands, but by fates. One afternoon, as she left the library, she found a fresh rose on top of her backpack. Beside it, a new note, "I'm almost ready." It made her smile and cry. Her heart opened just a little more. With every quiet gesture, she understood. Some people reveal themselves slowly, not out of fear, but because they're afraid of ruining something that's already beautiful in silence. Sometimes the first step toward healing isn't screaming for help. It's writing your story with trembling hands and a soul that's still bleeding. And when healing begins, love finds a place to bloom, even in the cracks. The morning the envelope from Harvard arrived at Daniel's house, he thought it was a mistake. His name, printed on the front, trembled in his ink-stained hands, and for a second he hesitated to open it. But when he read the words, "Full scholarship granted by anonymous donor," his knees buckled. A reverent silence filled the tiny room he called home. "Elizabeth," he whispered to himself. It was the only explanation that made any sense, or at least the one he wanted to believe. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was walking between the shelves at the community library when her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel, a photo of the letter and a caption that read, "I did it because of you." Her heart skipped a beat. The tears came before the smile did. It felt like watching spring bloom in the middle of winter. But doubt followed quickly. How? Who would fund something so extraordinary, and why? The signature was clear. Sponsored by the WW Foundation. 3 letters that didn't sound unfamiliar. That afternoon, she ran to the park, letter in hand. The sky was overcast, and the wind carried leaves like bitter confetti. William was there, like always. But this time, Elizabeth didn't approach gently. She walked straight toward him, eyes burning. "It was you, wasn't it?" she said, holding out the letter. He didn't respond. "You paid for this. The books, the scholarship, the library, everything." His silence confirmed more than any words ever could. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of shock and fury. William lowered his gaze, his shoulders sagging under the weight of something too big to name. "Because I didn't want you to see me the way they do, as a name, a legacy." Elizabeth frowned, confused. "William Wellington, the third," he said, the words landing like a centuries-old confession. And in that moment, Elizabeth's world turned upside down. She stepped back. You're from the founding family of the Academy?" He nodded, eyes brimming with tears. "I walked away from all of it years ago. The school, the board, the mansion, after I lost my wife and son in an accident. I couldn't live in that world anymore. I chose to disappear, to just be someone else, to look for real people." Elizabeth felt her throat tighten. "And you found me. I saw you that day at the hearing. When they fired you, I watched you stand up to them with courage. I saw your eyes, and I remembered mine. But you still believed in people. I didn't." Tears were now streaming down William's face. "You made me want to breathe again." Elizabeth sank onto the bench, her heart racing. It was too much to process. The gardener who saved her from loneliness was the same man quietly guiding Daniel's fate and her own. "You orchestrated everything," she said. "The scholarship, the library, even my safety." She looked around, as if trying to connect invisible dots. William dropped to his knees in front of her. "I didn't do it to win you, Elizabeth. I did it because you deserve it, because the world needs you, and because I love you, even if you never forgive me for hiding who I am." The silence between them was thick, filled with love, fear, and everything unsaid. Elizabeth covered her face with her hands. It felt like the universe had played a cruel, poetic trick on her. She didn't know whether to cry from anger or gratitude. The man she had fallen for was a ghost of the same elite that had exiled her, but also the gentle soul who helped her survive. William wasn't two different men. He was one, broken, generous, hiding behind his own pain. Not all heroes wear capes. Sometimes they wear dirt-stained gloves and carry scars instead of crests. But what Elizabeth would do with all this, even she didn't know yet. She didn't know how much time had passed since the revelation. His words still echoed in her head like distant bells. William Wellington III. It was like the world had split in two, before and after that moment. Now she paced in circles around her apartment, clutching the scholarship letter as if it were made of glass. What was real? The quiet gardener, the millionaire heir, or both? The next day she couldn't work. She cancelled all her lessons, ignored her messages. Even her tea went cold in a forgotten cup. When she finally gathered the courage, she walked back to the community library. The scent of paper comforted her as always, but everything felt heavier now. She walked to the shelf where his notes usually appeared. There was nothing, no poems, no clues, just silence. And the kind of emptiness that grows when trust begins to crack. That night she didn't sleep. At sunrise, without really thinking, she took the path to the park. He was there, sitting on the same bench where everything began, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on the ground. When he saw her, he stood. "Elizabeth." His voice was almost a whisper, broken at the edges. She didn't answer right away. She stood in front of him and looked into his eyes, the same eyes that had once made her feel so safe. But now, everything felt different. "You lied to me," she said, "all this time." He shook his head slowly. "I never lied about what I felt. I just hid who I was, and that was cowardly." Elizabeth crossed her arms. "I opened up to you, told you things I've never told anyone, and you stayed quiet, hiding behind a name that destroyed me." William's shoulders dropped. The pain on his face was raw. "I know, but I destroyed myself too, Elizabeth. I just didn't want you to see me for what I lost, or what I inherited. I wanted you to see me." A light rain began to fall, as if the sky needed to wash itself clean too. Elizabeth took a step forward. "You talk about pain like you own it. But what about mine? Do you know what it's like to starve, to be rejected for doing the right thing? You had every tool to change things, and you only acted when it was convenient." William fought back tears. It wasn't convenience, it was fear. "You were the first living thing I'd felt in years. I didn't want to lose that, not because of a last name." They stood there, under the drizzle, like two ancient souls meeting after centuries of silence. "So what now?" Elizabeth asked softly. "What do you expect from me, William?" He hesitated, eyes glassy. "Nothing. I just needed you to know. And if there's still a place in you, for me as I am, not who I was, then I'll wait." The honesty in his words tore down the wall she'd been building. Elizabeth looked up at the sky, closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The truth was, she still loved him. Even through the confusion, the pain, the fear, she loved the man who left roses at her door, who wrote poems, who listened without judgment. But she also loved cautiously, with scars, with questions that needed time to heal. "I don't know, William. Not yet. But I do know. I don't want you to go." He nodded, asked for nothing more, just gently took her hand. The rain grew heavier, and the two stood there, as if the world could pause just long enough for a choice to be made. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a fresh start, but it was something. A gesture, a choice not to run. Sometimes love doesn't need promises, just the courage to stay, even when everything tells you to leave. And that day, in the middle of the rain, two broken souls chose to keep going, even without knowing how their story would end. The days that followed were quiet, but different. There was a new kind of peace in Elizabeth's heart, not an absence of pain, but a gentler way of living with it, as if she had finally realized that carrying scars was also a form of courage. William didn't pressure her, he didn't push. He simply showed up when she let him, with the same quiet tenderness as always. Now she saw him fully, his grief, his generosity, his flaws. And strangely, that only made him more human. It was during that phase that Elizabeth got an unexpected call. An educational foundation was looking for a new director to lead a social project for at-risk youth. "Your name came to us through an anonymous recommendation," they said. She smiled, knowing exactly where that invisible hand came from. After so many closed doors, here was one crafted precisely for the kind of heart she carried. The school was housed in a restored old mansion, airy classrooms, wide windows, a bright library. As Elizabeth stepped inside, her eyes welled with tears. It wasn't just a job, it was a second chance, a way to do for other children what she had once tried to do for Daniel. When she accepted the role, William left a flower on her desk, quietly, without a word. It was the same flower from that very first bouquet. Tucked beside it was a note. "Now it's your turn to light up the world." Daniel came back too, more mature, distant from his old crowd, his eyes carrying the gratitude of someone who finally understood what he had received. They met again on a rainy afternoon, like so many before. "You never gave up on me," he said, gripping his backpack with the Harvard letter inside. "You were the only one who saw me for who I was. Not as a problem." Elizabeth cried, deeply moved. "You are my greatest poem, Daniel. And now, the world gets to read you." Their friendship blossomed like never before. He started giving talks at the school, inspiring other teens. It was like their story had become a lighthouse, guiding new paths. And Elizabeth, now a mentor and leader, rediscovered herself day by day. The pain still lived inside her, but now it had a place, a name, a meaning. It had become strength. William, too, began to open up more. He spoke of his lonely childhood, the weight of the Wellington name, the tragedy that had silenced him. And she listened, with a heart wide open. Their love wasn't built on grand promises, it was built on small things that meant everything. Shared coffees, discussed books, quiet moments on a park bench, a mature love, a whispered love, one without urgency. One Friday afternoon, after a school meeting, Elizabeth was called into the main hall. There stood the teachers, the students, even former colleagues. One student stepped forward and said, "This school exists because someone once believed that teaching is an act of love." And she never stopped loving. Elizabeth broke down in tears. It was the first time she'd received recognition without having to fight for it, and this time no one could take it away from her. On the walk home, she and William strolled side by side, hands intertwined. He didn't say much, just smiled, That quiet kind of smile that knows the most beautiful love isn't the one that arrives suddenly, but the one that stays, despite everything. Elizabeth stopped and looked at him. "Thank you for staying." He squeezed her hand and replied, "You gave me a reason. Sometimes the ending isn't where everything is resolved, but where everything finally makes sense." And there, between books, silence, and flowers, Elizabeth finally discovered what it truly meant to start over. The school auditorium was packed. Students, alumni, parents, educators, and even reporters filled the room with anticipation. It was a special day. The school was celebrating its first student accepted into one of the world's most prestigious universities. Daniel walked up to the stage with a shy smile, Harvard's letter in his pocket, a handwritten speech in his hand. "Today isn't about me," he began. "It's about the one who believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." The room fell silent as he told his story. The boy who used to sleep on park benches, who read in hiding at the library, who nearly got expelled for standing up to cruelty, and who was saved by a woman who gave him books, food, hope, and a piece of home. "Elizabeth Harper wasn't just my teacher," he said, eyes wet. "She was my bridge." When she was called up to the stage, the crowd rose in a standing ovation. Some cried, others smiled through tears. Elizabeth climbed the steps in disbelief, her eyes shining, her heart pounding. She had never imagined receiving so much love, so much light, after living through so much abandonment. "Teaching is planting, without knowing if you'll ever harvest," she said into the mic. "But sometimes, when the soil is rich with soul, the harvest becomes a miracle." The room held its breath, as if everyone was absorbing that truth like a needed whisper. Then, from the back of the room, William stood. He quietly walked to the stage as the audience murmured. In his hands, a small, simple box. Elizabeth looked at him, stunned, her face softening. Without saying a word, he knelt in front of her. "You saved 2 lives, Elizabeth, Daniel's and mine, and I don't want to live away from that anymore." He opened the box. A modest silver ring, nothing flashy, but filled with meaning. The auditorium erupted. Cheers, applause, tears. Elizabeth covered her mouth, unable to hold back her sobs. She nodded, smiling through the crying. William stood and held her tightly, like someone finding home after being lost for years. In that embrace, there was everything: pain, healing, love, forgiveness, and promise. The celebration continued with laughter and music, but they slipped out early. They walked to the park where it all began. The same tree, the same bench, the same peace. They sat in silence, hands intertwined, watching birds flutter among the leaves. "Do you remember the first time you gave me a flower?" she asked. "I remember every petal," he replied, "and how you, without knowing, watered everything I thought was dead." That night, Elizabeth wrote her final note before publishing her book. She placed it between the pages of the notebook where it all began. Love isn't about who arrives first. It's about who stays, even after everything. The book would be titled The Library of Silence, a tribute to a life written between the pages that were never read out loud. Have you ever helped someone like that, or been helped when you needed it most? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need a new beginning. And in the next video, you'll meet a single mom who was rejected for having a child until a stranger changed everything at a grocery store.